a forgotten trunk in an attic, a photograph that should not exist, and a silent man standing beside Abraham Lincoln, whose face appears nowhere in the history books. This is the story of how one ordinary afternoon of spring cleaning turned into a discovery that left historians speechless, that made trained conservators doubt their own instruments, and that pulled one family into a secret buried for more than a century. Before we get into what was actually found inside that photograph, you need to understand how close it came to never being discovered at all. Claire Donovan was not looking for history that afternoon. She was looking for storage space. Her grandmother's house had been sitting mostly untouched since the funeral, and Claire had finally worked up the nerve to start sorting through decades of accumulated belongings before the estate sale. The attic was the last room on her list, hot, cramped, and smelling faintly of cedar and old paper. Tucked beneath a stack of moth-eaten quilts sat a leather trunk with a cracked brass latch, the kind of object that looks like it belongs in a museum rather than a family home. Inside were the things you would expect from a household that had survived generations without ever really letting anything go. There were railroad bonds nobody would ever cash, a pair of yellowed lace gloves, bundles of letters tied together with string that crumbled the moment she touched them, and a scattering of tarnished buttons that had long since lost whatever coat they once belonged to. Then, near the bottom, her fingers brushed against something firmer than paper, a leather-bound photo album, its spine cracked and its corners curled like dried leaves. Most of what was inside matched what she expected from a family album that old. Rows of stiff, formal portraits, the kind where nobody smiles because holding still for the camera took real effort. Men in high collars, women with severe hairstyles, children who all somehow looked like tiny, unhappy adults. But tucked near the very back of the album, sealed inside a sleeve of wax paper unlike anything else in the book, was a single photograph that did not belong with the rest. Claire did not open it right away. She finished cleaning first, told herself she was being practical, and then finally sat down with the album on her lap and peeled back the wax paper. What she saw made her forget to breathe for a moment. There, in photographic clarity so sharp it barely seemed real, was Abraham Lincoln. He stood in a black frock coat, his familiar tall hat tilted slightly against the light, positioned toward the edge of the frame. Beside him sat an empty wooden chair, oddly deliberate in its placement. Around him stood a cluster of high-ranking Union officers in mid-conversation, their sabers drawn at their sides, and Claire recognized two of the faces almost immediately from textbooks: Ulysses Grant and George Meade. It was not the famous faces that made her hands begin to shake, though. It was the color. This was not a black and white photograph that someone had tinted afterward with paint or dye, the way period photographs were sometimes touched up decades later for display. This was full, natural color, embedded directly into the image itself. The deep blue of the Union uniforms, the dusty brown leather of the boots, the visible grain of the wooden chair, even the subtle creases catching light across the fabric of Lincoln's coat. It looked less like a 19th century photograph and more like a modern picture someone had dressed up to look old. There was one obvious problem. Color photography, in any meaningful sense, simply did not exist during the era this image claimed to be from. Claire knew enough basic history to understand that much. She was holding something that, by every rule she had ever learned, should not have been possible to create. Rather than post a photo online or try to sell it, Claire did the one thing that felt responsible. She reached out to George Kramer, a historian who specialized in Civil War-era photography and who had once given a guest lecture at her university. When he arrived and finally laid eyes on the print, he did not say a single word for what felt like an uncomfortably long stretch of time. He simply leaned in closer, his hands visibly trembling as he examined the surface. Eventually he asked her, in a low and deliberate voice, to explain exactly where the photograph had come from. Claire walked him through everything: the attic, the trunk, the wax paper sleeve. Kramer listened without interrupting, then pointed to the texture of the paper stock itself and told her something that made her pulse quicken. This was consistent with the silver-based printing process used decades in the past, a process that had absolutely no chemical capacity to hold color of this kind. Claire asked him the obvious question: was it fake? Kramer's answer, delivered almost reluctantly, was the opposite of reassuring. It was not fake. That, he told her, was the frightening part. He arranged for the photograph to be examined by specialists at a respected historical archive, where a team, including a forensic imaging expert and a paper conservator, put the image under equipment far more sophisticated than anything Claire had access to on her own. What the analysis revealed only deepened the mystery. The pigments were not sitting on top of the print. They were embedded directly into the photographic emulsion itself, as though the color had been baked into the image during its original development. It resembled an extremely early, extremely primitive version of color photography technology that would not be properly invented until roughly half a century later. Every test the lab ran confirmed the same impossible result. Organic pigments, early photochemical compounds, all dated convincingly to the correct period. This was not a modern forgery slipped into an old frame. Somehow, impossibly, a working color photographic process had existed decades before anyone believed it was technically possible, and someone had used it to capture this exact moment. While the technicians obsessed over pigment chemistry and paper composition, Claire found herself fixated on something else entirely. Standing quietly between Lincoln and Grant was a slim, unremarkable figure whose face appeared nowhere in any Civil War archive she or Kramer could locate. Unlike the officers surrounding him, this man wore no visible rank, no ceremonial saber, no obvious symbol of authority. His uniform was plain, almost deliberately unremarkable, and his expression carried a strange stillness, focused and alert in a way that made him look less like a bystander caught in the frame and more like someone who belonged there on purpose. Something about his face nagged at Claire's memory, and it took her a moment to place why. She pulled up an old scan on her phone, a much later photograph from her own family's collection, showing a heavier, older man standing outside a barn with one hand resting on a dog's head. The clothing was different, the posture was different, but the jawline, the set of the ears, the particular slope of the eyebrows were unmistakably the same. She whispered to Kramer that this had to be her great-great-grandfather. He looked up sharply, clearly startled, and asked her to repeat herself. She held her phone beside the photograph so he could compare the two images directly, and he moved his gaze back and forth between them with visibly growing unease. He muttered that this man appeared in no official Civil War service record he was aware of, and speculated aloud that perhaps he had simply been a volunteer or a civilian who happened to be standing in uniform. Claire shook her head. She remembered her grandfather telling stories about a relative named William Donovan, a man who had apparently served during the war and vanished before it ended, with no further explanation ever passed down through the family. He had simply been listed, according to family memory, as missing. She opened her laptop and began searching digitized military service records. Within minutes, she found an entry that matched. Donovan William, listed as a medic attached to an infantry regiment. Status recorded as missing in action. Last confirmed sighting placed him only days before the eventual Confederate surrender that effectively ended major combat operations. No further explanation was offered anywhere in the record. Kramer stared at the screen for a long moment before pointing out something troubling. The date attached to Donovan's disappearance fell just before the surrender at Appomattox. Claire felt her stomach drop as the implication settled in. If William Donovan had already vanished from his unit by that point, how could he possibly be standing directly beside Lincoln in a photograph that appeared to have been taken during that very meeting, an event for which no verified photograph was believed to exist at all, only sketches, engravings, and second-hand written accounts? If the image really was authentic, it would represent the only known photographic record of that historic moment. For Claire, the excitement of that possibility was quickly overtaken by something heavier. If her ancestor had been deliberately placed in that photograph, then someone else, at some point, had gone to considerable effort to make sure the rest of the world forgot he was ever there. Missing records, vague, half-remembered family stories, a photograph seemingly never intended to survive at all. None of it felt accidental. It felt engineered. She suddenly recalled an old, barely legible letter her grandfather had once shown her as a child, written decades after the war by William Donovan himself. One line from that letter had always stuck with her, even though as a child she had no idea what it meant. It instructed that if anyone in the family ever found a photograph containing a particular chair, they should destroy it immediately, because it was never meant to be kept. standing in that lab, surrounded by scientific equipment confirming the photograph's impossible authenticity. Claire finally understood that warning was not superstition. It was a message meant to protect someone. Back at the archive, Kramer spent the following days digging through War Department records, searching for any additional trace of William Donovan. Late one evening he called Claire, his voice tight with exhaustion and something close to disbelief, and told her she needed to come see what he had found immediately. He had located a rarely accessed field memo dated within days of Donovan's official disappearance. It was a single terse line, cryptic by design, instructing that Donovan be moved to what it called a shadow post at the request of someone referred to only as Al, with explicit instructions that the transfer not be formally logged and that weapons remain undrawn unless absolutely necessary. Claire asked the obvious question, who was Al? Kramer explained that War Department was a fairly standard abbreviation, but that Al appeared, based on private correspondence among Lincoln's closest aides, to have been an informal nickname used only by his most trusted inner circle. The implication hung heavy in the room. Buried within an obscure, barely surviving fragment of wartime paperwork was a suggestion that, in the final stretch of the war, Lincoln himself may have quietly assembled a small group of men operating entirely outside the normal military chain of command. Men without formal rank, without public recognition, tasked simply with watching, protecting, and staying silent. William Donovan appeared to have been one of them. Additional fragments turned up as the two of them kept searching. References to unnamed escorts assigned to sensitive movements between command posts, selected specifically from outside the standard ranking system. These men carried no visible insignia and left behind almost no paperwork, their only instructions being to observe quietly and protect certain key individuals without drawing attention to themselves. The most concrete evidence, however, did not come from paperwork at all. It came from a photograph itself. Elsa, the forensic imaging specialist working alongside Kramer, was running another detailed scan of the image when she paused abruptly over Donovan's coat collar. Hidden beneath the folded lapel of his jacket, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was a small, carefully stitched patch, faded and worn, but still legible. 3 letters representing what Kramer immediately recognized, based on scattered references buried in old personal diaries and coded wartime correspondence, as an informal, undocumented group, sometimes referred to as a presidential escort committee. No such organization existed in any official capacity, but the theory, according to Kramer, was that as his presidency neared its end, Lincoln had grown wary of relying entirely on his official cabinet and military hierarchy, and had quietly arranged for a small number of loyal individuals to serve as his own personal eyes and ears in the field. That tiny stitched patch transformed everything. It meant William Donovan had not simply vanished from his regiment through some clerical accident. He had been deliberately reassigned, pulled out of standard military structure, and placed directly at Lincoln's, side by Lincoln's own design. Just when it seemed the photograph had revealed everything it possibly could, Elsa noticed something else while re-examining that same coat collar. Beneath the small stitch patch was another line of thread, so faint it nearly blended entirely into the wool of the uniform. It was not damage. It was not a stray repair. It had been placed there on purpose. Using more sensitive imaging equipment, she was able to isolate the thread clearly enough to read it. Stitched in careful, deliberate lettering, using thread only a shade lighter than the surrounding fabric, were a handful of words, confirmation that a target had been verified, along with an instruction to remain in position until a specific date in the middle of that April, the very same date history remembers as the night Lincoln was assassinated. The room went completely silent. If this stitched message was genuine, it suggested that William Donovan had not simply been standing near Lincoln by chance. He may have known in advance that some kind of threat against the president's life had already been identified, and that his assignment was to remain close and alert until that specific date arrived. The paper conservator working alongside Kramer and Elsa pointed out that the phrasing did not sound like ordinary patrol language at all. It read like a direct assignment, complete with a defined window of time rather than the simple location to guard. Suddenly Donovan's disappearance from official records did not look like an accident or a bureaucratic oversight. It looked deliberate. It looked like something had gone wrong, and someone, afterward, had worked very hard to make sure his involvement was never traced or explained. Claire thought again of her ancestor's old letter, the one instructing his descendants to destroy the photograph if they ever found it. She finally understood why. That photograph was not simply evidence that Donovan had once stood near a famous historical figure. It was proof that he had known something in advance, that he may have been positioned specifically to prevent tragedy, and that whatever happened afterward had been serious enough to erase him almost entirely from the historical record rather than risk the truth becoming public. Nobody in that room could say for certain what had actually happened to Donovan after that date. Perhaps he tried to intervene and failed. Perhaps the orders meant to guide him never reached him in time. Perhaps, more troubling still, he was quietly removed from the picture before he ever had the chance to act at all. What remained beyond doubt was that someone had gone to considerable effort to stitch that warning into his uniform, and that shortly afterward, William Donovan effectively disappeared from history. With the mystery surrounding Donovan himself growing deeper by the day, Elsa turned her full attention back to the photograph's other impossible feature, the color itself. From the very first examination, everyone involved had agreed that something about the image felt wrong in a way that went beyond its subject matter. It was simply too clear, too detailed, too far ahead of what photography from that era should have been capable of producing. Running the image through another round of specialized scanning, isolating the pigment layers themselves, Elsa confirmed what she had begun to suspect. This was not a photograph that had been colored after the fact, through hand painting or tinting. The color existed within the emulsion itself, chemically bonded into the image during its original development process. The paper conservator working alongside her insisted this should not have been technically achievable using materials available at the time. The silver-based photographic stock common to that era simply was not chemically compatible with the kind of dyes required to produce genuine embedded color. And yet, somehow, this particular photograph had managed exactly that. Elsa's full analysis identified layers of natural binding agents alongside organic pigments, including compounds derived from common plant-based dyes of the period, combined in ways that had apparently never been formally documented in any surviving record of early photographic experimentation. It looked, by every measure available to modern forensic imaging, like an early, deeply experimental prototype of color photography, decades ahead of when such technology was believed to have first emerged. Claire stared at the screen, struggling to process what she was hearing. This was not simply an old photograph. It was, in every meaningful sense, a prototype. While digging further through archived personal papers connected to well-known Civil War-era photographers, Elsa eventually turned up a brief journal entry from an assistant who had once worked alongside one of the most celebrated photographers of the period. The entry referenced a private request from the president himself for a single, unique image intended purely as a personal legacy piece, developed quietly and never intended for public display or demonstration. Kramer suggested this fit entirely with what they already knew of Lincoln's character. He was not a man particularly concerned with vanity, but he was deeply concerned with meaning, with ensuring that certain things survived beyond his own lifetime. If Lincoln had personally commissioned an experimental photographic process specifically because he wanted something durable enough to outlast the erosion of ordinary memory, then everything about this strange, impossible photograph suddenly made sense. This was never meant to be viewed by the public. It was not created for propaganda or for official military archives. It appeared to have been crafted as something closer to a private time capsule, meant to preserve not just faces and uniforms, but a hidden message intended only for someone willing to look closely enough, someday, long after everyone involved was gone.